Hello, Rune Scholar, wherever and whenever you are. I'm the modern Erilar. Over the course of the last several episodes, I have described the runes of the Younger Futhark in various Scandinavian controlled areas. And while the Younger Futhark is definitely Viking, the Younger Futhark is also medieval. In today's episode, I'd like to describe the greater complexity that shaped the medieval practice of writing runes, though the extent to which this occurred, or if it even occurred at all, varied across Scandinavia. One of the prominent features of medieval Futharks is the presence of stung or dotted runes, which I discussed extensively in episode 10. This development reintroduced distinction between voiced and unvoiced consonants within the written language that had disappeared with the pre-Viking transition from Elder Futhark to Younger. Stung runes first appeared during the Viking Age, though only stung is, stung kaun, and stung ur were used to any great degree before the medieval period. In Denmark, a stung bjørko appears along with stung tyr and stung thorn on coins minted for Sven Estridsson between 1065 and 1076. These various dotted runes spread unevenly across rune-literate areas and were introduced at different times in different areas. The dotted kaun and bjørko runes in Norway, for example, only appear in the 12th century, and stung tyr appeared in Scotland only in the 14th. The dotted bjørko was gradually overtaken in Norway and Iceland after the 13th century by this new rune, which I introduced in my last episode on Iceland. Later on Gotland, we see a fairly localized use of a stung lauker for a type of L, and in one inscription, a unique stung kaun for the NG sound, and a stung nauth for a local variety of N. In Greenland, this variant of a stung ur with a line instead of a dot can be used for a couple different O sounds, either like the word home or an open rounded O like in the word horse. I mentioned in my Icelandic episode as well that the later Icelanders preferred rings to dots when writing their stung runes, and stung is probably where this stands out the most. Both the Icelanders and some of the Norwegians adopted this practice, which we can see very clearly in inscription N79 on a gravestone from Uya Church in Vong, Valdres, where the E runes here look very much like a mirrored thorn rune. Uya also usefully illustrates the use of the star form of the h-rune for a fricative G sound, like the modern Greek llama or the G spoken in the Spanish word amigo. And this rune appears here in the name Erich Preist. I mentioned in episode 11 on Sweden that rune writers in Uppland started to use this rune for this sound after the beginning of the 11th century. Scholars have various explanations for how this usage evolved, but we don't yet have enough data to support a specific chronology before the 11th century. Terjus Berkland suggested that there could have been a connection to Latin literacy, in particular the use of the letter X, as he read the phrase Tora Mother Eriks in this inscription. We also see the use of the star rune for a fricative G in Orkney, in the Faroes, and in Greenland. Medieval runes could also show other possible influences from Latin literacy in that we get greater vowel differentiation in the written language. One of the most useful introductions was to differentiate the short-twig A and its long branch variant, which had been used interchangeably during the Viking Age, such that one of them, the short-twig version, still represents the ah sound, but the long branch version evolves such that it represents the sound ah. And likewise, from two interchangeable O sounds that were used for whichever of the various sounds, more commonly, this rune would represent O, and this rune, the long branch variant, would represent Ö, or more commonly Ü, to reflect changes in the sound of the language between the Viking Age and the medieval period. Terje Spurkland posited in his book on Norwegian runes that this was a reaction to the one-to-one correspondence between sound and letter in the Latin alphabet, inspiring medieval Scandinavians to reverse the reduction of runes that created the Elder Futhark. Though Michael Barnes cautions us that the lack of consensus about which runic character corresponded to which Roman letter hardly points to a fixed and unchanging relationship between individual symbols of the two systems. And that is a fair point. Whether it was in reaction to Latin literacy or not, the distinction here between vowel sounds probably developed in Norway and Sweden in the first half of the 12th century, spreading to Denmark in the latter half of the 12th century. By the 13th century, we see rune writers regularly start to incorporate doubled consonants into their spelling to indicate a longer consonant sound. This technique was used, rarely before this time, for example in Old English inscriptions, though the sound change in Old Norse had occurred by the 4th century of the Common Era. Gemination of consonants, as it's called, lengthens their pronunciation in a way that changes the meaning of the word, and in English it also affects the vowels around the consonant that's doubled. So, for example, in English, in modern English, striped is different to the word stripped, and desert is different to dessert, though the only difference between those word pairs is the doubling of the consonant in the middle. Richard Page, in his study of doubled runes, thought that if the early rune masters used only single runes for long or repeated sounds, and later practitioners, becoming aware of the scribal use of double letters, may have tried to adopt the practice and made occasional mistakes in doing so. So again, this medieval change may indicate the influence of Latin literacy on runic usage. During the Viking Age, words like theta, for this, or that, really, that would have been spelled during the Viking Age with a single T, but by the 13th century and later, it would have been spelled with two T's. In some inscriptions, this was accomplished by writing the rune twice, like you see here, though in other inscriptions, the twig of the rune would be written twice onto a single stave, creating what's called a bind rune. Double consonants are not the only rune pairs to be expressed as bind runes, and this isn't necessarily an innovation so much as a reintroduction. If you think back to episode 4 on the Elder Futhark, bind runes appeared in pre-Viking inscriptions, and the go sequence on the Kragahul spearshaft is a good example. Elder Futhark texts regularly featured bind runes, like this O's Kaun pair or this Tyr Raith pair here. They were rare in the Viking period, when most examples seem to be attempts to correct runes that were carved incorrectly. So bind runes in Viking Age might be mostly indications of mistakes, but in the medieval period, bind runes again reappeared in runic usage. Mindy MacLeod, who has written the most extensive work on this topic, found no specific spelling conventions that would have been the same in both Latin ligatures and vernacular bind runes, but she does indicate that several of the texts that contain bind runes are in Latin, and points out a few obvious examples of influence from Latin into Swedish inscriptions in particular. The influence of ligature on bind runes may then have been more general or simply an archaic practice that returned to popularity, in that it was a local evolution that happened to happen at the same time as Latin literacy was increasing. So in summary, the characteristics that indicate a shift to medieval runic usage are dotted runes, the use of the star rune as a fricative G sound, a greater vowel differentiation by contrasting the short-twig and long-branch variants of the same rune within the same inscription, the use of bind runes, and the use of doubled consonants in inscriptions. Medieval Futhark systems established only gradually in various parts of Scandinavia, though, and in some places not at all. For example, in Uppland, many early 12th century runestones showed no distinction between the various A sounds, and both the shape of the runes and how the words were spelled remained very similar to how each appeared during the Viking Age. And the same is true in Sigtuna until the latter 12th century. In Västergötland, however, in the latter 12th century, massive gravestones show typically medieval features, such as the long twig distinction between various vowel sounds. We see stung runes for D, F, which is that D with a line in the top, the P and the B. And we also see doubled consonants in Västergötland as well. So perhaps rune writers in Västergötland had closer contact with Latin literacy than those in Uppland, or possibly more influence from Norway, where these features seem to have established relatively early. Interestingly, none of these new runes seem to have been considered by contemporaries to have been a new rune, and they don't appear in the rune row. In the vast majority of the many medieval rune row inscriptions, very few contain anything other than the 16 runes of the Younger Futhark. And for example, only about 8 out of 125 medieval Norwegian inscriptions is anything other than the Younger Futhark. This is quite evident when we look at the top of the rune rows here. This is B38 from Viking and Bergen, and B35 is one of those only 8 inscriptions from Viking as well. That second inscription has added 2 additional runes at the end, but the vast majority of the rune rows that we see look like the top inscription here. The Norwegian and the Icelandic rune poems as originally written only discuss the typical 16 rune Futhark. And when we do see more than 16 runes in a rune row, carvers did not follow a single systematic order when adding runes to the Futhark. So there's no observable consensus that we can understand from the contemporary record on which extra runes may be included in that fewer than 10% of inscriptions with additional runes, or indeed how many of those extra runes appear as part of the rune row. In 5 medieval instances in the runic record, we observe rune rows that switch to an alphabetic instead of a Futhark order, which very clearly shows influence from Latin literacy, but many of these are themselves recorded in manuscripts, so of course they show strong influence from Latin literacy. In this French copy of the Prax Apostolis from 1022 of the Common Era, where this runic alphabet appears in the left margin of an image of the risen Christ, we see runes that correspond to most of the letters of the Latin alphabet in predominantly alphabetic order, with a couple exceptions and omissions. We would already expect to see the dotted E, the dotted G, the dotted P in this instance is a little bit of a surprise, And this stung kaun for Q is very logical. The reoccurrence of the star rune here toward the end of the rune row, even though it appears usually where we would expect it to be for H, we have it here toward the end, and this may indicate that in fact Spurkland is right about it also standing for X or having come from that usage. Runic writing then seems to have coexisted comfortably with Latin literacy, though the degree to which runes were influenced by manuscripts is still very much not agreed upon. You may even have heard about a manuscript that was itself written in runes. This is the Codex Runicus, and it was Danish. And it's so odd that we should probably elaborate on it in our next episode. Thank you for reading the runes with me, the Modern Erilar.